Joining us, this is the France 24 debate. We're discussing France on all fronts on this Bastille Day. We're talking about it with Laurent Henninger of the Strategic Research Institute at Paris's École Militaire. Also with us, Philip Stoner, or should I say Captain Philip Stoner, former Deputy UK Defense Attaché here in Paris, and Dave Clark of the French news agency AFP. We were mentioning before the break, 6 French soldiers killed in the past 24 hours in Afghanistan. Before that military parade, the French president visiting the wounded in hospital and alluding to the drawdown that's about to begin. 1/4 of France's 4,000 military personnel to return in the coming year. The rest by 2014. The French president argues that successes on the battlefield are changing the nature of the mission.
What happened is even more unacceptable since the soldiers were taking part in a village council. A council to reconcile different Afghan factions, to spur development so that life can return to normal. More and more, it's these kind of attacks, not military ones, that we're facing.
Dave Clark, from your experience in Iraq, where we saw a surge and then the drawdown, it's tricky for the French soldiers because they're announced they're starting to leave, they're starting to pack up. At the same time, they've been in this situation where there has been heavy fighting, and now they claim that they find themselves in a situation where they're going to be more and more the targets of not combat but terror attacks.
But when the Americans changed their tactics in Iraq to recruit more Sunnis, former insurgents, and to reach out to the communities, to put more people in the communities, to put more people in small combat outposts, it was the change of tactics that made a lot of the difference. And a lot of the Iraqis were changing sides at that point anyway, because Al-Qaeda had upset so many people with their extremism and with their bomb attacks. But it was backed up by an extra surge in troops, which gave the impression to the combatants on the ground that America was serious about carrying this through. Now, the French soldiers are going out to meetings in village halls now, holding shurahs with local leaders, at the same time as they're announcing that 1/4 of their troops are coming home. Over the next 12 months. They're not on the front foot batting right now in Afghanistan. The Taliban know that they're going home, and they're going to want to hold a victory parade when they go. So yes, they're not confronting the French troops militarily, as President Sarkozy suggests. They are carrying out suicide bomb attacks and opportunistic attacks like this one. But that's what guerrillas do. No guerrilla army in the world would take on the French army face to face. You have to expect that.
Philip Stoner, the French have been involved in Afghanistan since the start. However, would it be fair to argue that really it's only since President Sarkozy was elected in 2007 that they've started really taking part in battle in the hot spots, and that therefore Dave Clark was talking about boxing above your weight category in the first part. Are the French in a position where over a long period of time it's very difficult to sustain something like that in a place like Afghanistan?
That's slightly untrue. I think they've always been there. They've always been in the thick of it in different levels. Previously, under Chirac, there was a sort of temptation to sort of like send them out there, they can do what they have to do, and let's not talk about it too much at home. You might remember there was a particular case, I think back in 2006, 2005, when French Special Forces had a very bad incident, and they were actually defeated on the ground, and that was extremely embarrassing. Since then, Sarkozy, in some ways, turned up the tempo. He's becoming a bit harder, and to a certain extent, sort of, increased numbers out in Afghanistan, and really sort of shown, look, we can do this alongside the Americans, not in the same numbers, but in a similar way, and being, basically hitting on the front foot. So Sarkozy's been right up there in the front of them, and trying to make things happen. But of course, now, exactly as Dave was saying, we have a situation where we're sending out a mixed message. And we have French soldiers basically coming back now from Afghanistan thinking, well, have we succeeded? Have we achieved what we wanted to achieve? You know, the generals might say we have, yes, fine. But the reality is we find it very difficult to look at ourselves honestly in the mirror and describe what we see. I think that's the problem. When Sarkozy says, great, you know, we're doing all the right things, but it's not been appreciated on the ground, he's not actually seeing it, I think, as he should be seeing, which is the reality is not actually the one we want to get.
So there is the perception, and yet when you look at the forces, again, we can perhaps look at images of from this morning's parade of the Chasseurs Alpins, the mountain rangers, parading on the Champs-Élysées, a corps, there you see them, a corps trained to fight Laurent Henninger in Afghan-style mountains. When you look at that, and it gets back to what we were talking about in the first part, the French have something at times perhaps to bring that others don't necessarily have.
Well, it's one of the specialties of the French military forces to have strength in some very specific niche, and mountain warfare is obviously one of them. And the French mountain troops are probably among the best in the world, along with the Italian, the Austrian, and the Germans, who were famous in the other conflicts of the 20th century. But yes, generally, whenever one thinks about French elite forces, one thinks immediately, almost mechanically, to the Foreign Legion or the French Marines or the French paratroopers. But we always forget the French Chasseurs Alpins, alpine hunters, literally. But they are among our best troops, and they are in their perfect environment, milieu, in the Afghan mountains.
And when you hear that, Philip Stoner, do you wish the French had been perhaps more engaged in battle earlier?
No, I think that would be wrong. They have been engaged, and you know, politically things have changed since Chirac went and Sarkozy took over. But the problem is they're trying to do something using classic army techniques against an enemy which is basically fighting a dirty war, and it's a dirty war from the point of view of the French soldiers, the American soldiers, the British soldiers know that, you know, all being well, once they've done their duty, they're going to come home. That's not the same for the Afghan forces, the Afghan security police, who've got to stay there and live with the Taliban and live with, you know, the spectre of something dreadful happening to their children on the way home from school.
Which brings us to the other conflict where there's warfare going on right now, Libya, where earlier the week the French Parliament voted to extend France's mission there, but where also French politicians quick to predict an outcome by the fall. You mentioned in part one, Dave Clark, the problems they have with munitions. Do you get the sense that France and its NATO allies are just running out of gas?
Well, you know, we can buy more gas. If we can't defeat the army of Muammar Gaddafi, a mercenary force in a country of 6 million people, barely off our shores, then why have a European military? Yes, there's very, very bad economic circumstances in the moment in Europe. This is going to cost a lot of money. I'm not sure whether we've put in the means that we could or should have done to this particular conflict, but it's being fought with both hands behind our back. Effectively, they've gone in there to help the rebels, but because of the nature of the UN resolution, they have to pretend they're protecting civilians. So the rebels are civilians. They're not members of any military, but they've got Kalashnikovs, they've got rocket launchers, they've got jeeps. We have taken a side in a civil war, and wars go on until someone wins.
On the France 24 debate Facebook page, Don writes, France now realizes that the UN-authorized bombing raids, along with the undermanned rebels, will not be enough to rid Libya of Gaddafi, and now seems to be pushing for a negotiated peace. Best of luck. Dave Clark, this gets back to what Philip Stoner was saying about perceptions.
Well, yes, but on the other hand, I was in Benghazi during the initial stages of the rebellion, and it does show that France's willingness to use military force and to intervene beyond its borders is part of its soft power as well as its hard power. There were tricolores all over the streets of Benghazi, and everybody there personalised it very much. People said, "Thank you, Sarkozy. Thank you, Sarkozy." Being an AFP reporter was a great thing there, and that doesn't happen everywhere in the world. I have to tell you, there are countries where France is not the most welcome of interveners, and countries where they are very divided about that, like Côte d'Ivoire. But in rebel-held Libya, they love Sarkozy, and in government Libya, they hate him. When people hear the planes overhead, they say Sarkozy, as if he was piloting every one of them. And people kept asking me why Sarkozy was doing this to them when I was on the government side briefly. So it is a sign that France is still a player in this world. And as President Sarkozy himself said today after the parade, if we hadn't have done this, what would we have done? His strategic vision, to an extent, has been his union for the Mediterranean. This idea that we're living in a common space. And like I say, Libya is not very far away. I mean, we can fly there, from Sicily and from Crete. It's if the genocide or civil war breaks out there, then the refugees will be washing up in Lampedusa, in Malta, in Sicily, and eventually on Corsica and Saint-Tropez. So it's something that they had to do something about. I'm not sure. I think if Kingdom still had an aircraft carrier, it would probably be in the Gulf of Suez.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
But I think the point here is also that there was this, together with the Americans, there was this terror that Libya is going to become some sort of failed state. And with a problem on one side with Egypt and Tunisia not looking too sharp either, my God, how are we going to deal with that? And how's in the front line and on the south, with Italy and refugees coming in, as Dave was saying, we cannot deal with a failed state there. So we have to get involved, and I think that's how it was balanced up. And
that's regarding the decision that was made to go in. Laurent Henninger, when we see, for instance, the aircraft carrier, France only has one, the Charles de Gaulle. 6 of the last 9 months? There's been repairs, and it's it's a heavy lift keeping that one aircraft carrier up and running. Again, when you compare to France's past military might, what does that say?
It says that modern weapons cost more and more money. And nowadays, there's just one power on earth that can afford it, that can afford everything. It's the United States. Every other power is completely backwards compared to the United States. I mean, yes, the aircraft carrier, but we also have 2 helicopter carriers that are doing some fine job in, if I may say, in the Mediterranean against Libya. And I mean, we are facing, just like Britain is facing the same problem, we are facing a major shift, a major mutation in military might, in military affairs, and that's historical. It's not today's problem.
Which brings us to the question of changing military strategy and what they called before World War I the Entente Cordiale between France and the UK, for economic reasons, is getting stronger and stronger, it seems, with the idea being floated about that they'll be manning aircraft carriers soon together.
Well, I mean, that would be great if that was to happen. But, I mean, first of all, we have to convince industry that that's what we ought to be doing. That means basically shareholder value. That has to be brought into the factor. But just going back to what Laurent was saying, sure, the United States is the only country that can afford aircraft carriers. Well, I'm not quite sure what they can afford at the moment, but that's another issue. But go and ask the Indians, go and ask the Chinese how many aircraft carriers they're building. India, at least 3. China, probably, maybe even more. So the whole idea of aircraft carriers being limited to Western powers, America in particular, is something which is changing rapidly.
The European Union is 400 or more than 400 million people. It's a huge market. Its economy could rival that of the United States. It's a cultural thing as well. The Chinese have dreams of having strategic power. The Americans still have strategic power, even if they're in great debt and are relying on the Chinese to lend the money to continue to buy these aircraft carriers. Much of mainland Europe, not having seen war, well, we saw war in the Balkans, but not having seen war in the main Western countries of Europe since 1945, has turned its back on the military culture and on military instincts. To a certain extent, the United Kingdom and France still see themselves as military powers, but we saw the graph before, the percentage of spending. Not only is America much richer than us, the proportion of the national wealth that they're prepared to put to having a blue water navy and strategic nuclear weapons and network of satellites and veterans' salaries and pensions. The proportion of the money that they're prepared to spend on that is higher than the proportion we're prepared to put into it. And their public's willingness to accept casualties on the front line seems to be a lot stronger. The Germans are nowhere, and they are the biggest economy in Europe. Why isn't there a German aircraft carrier off Libya?
It's another story. If I may say, my point of view is the point of view of a historian. So I see things in longue durée as
long term.
Long term, yes. I think that if we try to think these strategic and military problems the way we do today, in pure financial and economic terms, there is no solution. And there is no solution. We don't have the money, okay? And we can't do what India and China do. I mean, Europe is not India, Europe is not China. Europe is different. And for up to now, it is still not a unified country. Mm-hmm. So we can't do exactly the same. The same. I think the solution, I think, humbly, if I may say, the solution lies not in trying to find a sort of magic formula to find money. The solution lies in thinking differently, out of the box, to new ways of waging wars, new ways of thinking wars, new ways of thinking the military in general. Maybe the solution is not the aircraft carrier as we know it since the Second World War. Maybe we have to think to something else.
Well, some people have thought, let's not fight wars.
That's another problem.
We can fund a military that can defend Europe.
That's another problem. I think we always will have wars, personally. You know, once again, as a historian.
But maybe if we're prioritizing money, we don't overthrow Laurent Gbagbo.
Well,
we don't intervene in a civil war in Libya.
Final point on this. The French Prime Minister touching down in Ivory Coast this Wednesday, Ivory Coast lobbying hard so that the French keep open their military base. Dave Clark, they've closed the one that they have in Senegal. The question is, and this is the final question here: will it be kept? Because will they always keep that presence? Because with military might comes diplomatic might,
and a certain amount of economic might. And it's not the richest country in the world, but the French still have a lot of national interests in West Africa. I think, as we were just discussing, that we're going to have to reprioritize our defense spending, and I'm not sure if maintaining a series of bases in West Africa is in France's long-term interests, but it clearly plays into something different than the question about where you put your helicopters, where you put your aircraft carriers, and so forth. There's an idea of France and an idea of where they have interest and where they do not. We still have bases in Germany, and they haven't really been a threat to us for quite a long time. People like having bases, and people like spending money.
We're going to have to unfortunately leave it there. I want to thank you, Philip Stoner. I want to thank Dave Clark, and I want to thank Laurent Henninger, and thank you for being with us for the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Coming up next, it's Business with Marcus Carlson.